Hey, if you're a fan of Aerosmith, and not necessarily the Aerosmith that was pumping out the hits in the late 80s, but maybe an Aerosmith that was a little bit earlier than that, I think you're going to really like this video. In 1985, Aerosmith put out an album that was kind of supposed to be a comeback album, but it almost became a too little too late album. And it was this album right here. This is my copy of it. It was called Done with Mirrors. And if you look at it, if you can make it out on the camera there, everything's written backwards, including all of the song names. Everything on here is written backwards. And you can see the band kind of in the text right there. And then there's another graphic on the front here that is from the inside sleeve. That's not important. Anyway, so what happened is in 1985, I'm at a record store, and I always liked Aerosmith, especially I love Toys in the Attic, of course, like everybody. When I started listening to music in the early 80s, that one jumps out at you because it has Walk This Way, and it has Toys in the Attic, and it has Sweet Emotion. So I love that stuff. And so in 1985, I'm walking through a record store, and I just see this record up on the shelf, and I got up closer, and it was Aerosmith. I was like, what is this? Well, apparently it had just come out with very little fanfare. And what this was it was, again, kind of a comeback album, because see, what happened was in 1979, Aerosmith put out an album called Night in the Ruts, and then that was the last time, at least for a little while, that you would see Joe Perry and Steven Tyler together. The drama between those two and the band Aerosmith is legendary. And so they parted ways. Joe Perry and Brad Whitford took off, and then Steven Tyler tried to keep Aerosmith going. And so they recruited another couple of guitarists. One of them was named Jimmy Crespo. And Jimmy Crespo he'd worked with a lot of fairly famous people, but he really hadn't done much, wasn't super famous himself. So Aerosmith picks him up. They put out a new album that's called A Rock in a Hard Place, and they went on a tour with that album. And they were basically at that point almost like has-beens. They were on the way out. Even though they did tour on that thing, they were dropping off fast. Well, then Joe Perry and Brad Whitford, after going off and doing some of their solo stuff, they come back with Steven Tyler, and they decide to get the band back together, and they put out this album, Aerosmith Done with Mirrors. And by the way, I absolutely loved this thing when I took it home. I thought it was spectacular, but it really got almost no fanfare, at least that I know of, that I ever saw at the time. It wasn't until their next album, which was Permanent Vacation, and then the one after that, which was Pump, where they really, really got back on the map. So this one, it felt like an almost too little too late album, except for one thing. The following year, Run-D.M.C is recording an album, and Rick Rubin, who's their producer, says, hey, I've got an idea. And he goes and he grabs this old Aerosmith song, which is Walk This Way, and he tells the guy in Run-D.M.C, I want to like do a rap version of this. We want to take these two sounds, Aerosmith, that old 70s hard rock, and rap, and put them together. And then, of course, that's the Walk This Way that you've heard on the radio. And even though this was supposed to be a comeback album, it didn't really work. But that thing with Run-D.M.C did. And then that put him on the map. Permanent Vacation comes out, they start on their way back up. And by the time Pump comes out, Love in an Elevator, everybody's heard that song, they were huge again. And then they just put out a bunch of hits after that. So anyway, but what this video is about is specifically this. First of all, do you remember this album? Did you own it? I actually thought this album was awesome. I loved it. And especially the very, very first song. And it's a song called Let the Music Do the Talking. And it's actually a song from Joe Perry's solo project. So anyway, we may talk about that more in just a second, but here's what I want to do in this video. Because I loved this album so much, and because of what it represented, I did some research, and I found some record reviews that came out at the time when this album was released. So I've got, they're very, very short, but I'm going to read them to you. And especially if you've ever heard this music, I want to hear what your thoughts are about these reviews, and do you relate to them? And they're very short, like I said, but I think you'll enjoy these. So here's the first one. This is in the Daily Oklahoman December 1st, 1985, page 106. Aerosmith, Done with Mirrors, Geffen Records. Aerosmith is back in the saddle again. More than 3 years since its last album or single, the five-man band from Boston is rock and rolling again. The five original members of the band playing together and in apparent harmony this time. How did Aerosmith do it? Well, it wasn't with mirrors. It was with real-life hard work, blood, sweat, and yes, a few tears. Early in 1984, Steven Tyler, Joe Perry, Brad Whitford, Tom Hamilton, and Joey Kramer decided to bury the hatchet and the heavy drugs. They reformed the original Aerosmith lineup, the lineup that produced some of the 70s best hard-driving, hard-hitting heavy metal in the same vein as the old Yardbirds and early Led Zeppelin. They began their Back in the Saddle tour in early 1984. It's interesting that they use that name, Back in the Saddle. If you don't know, that's an earlier Aerosmith hit, song called Back in the Saddle, one of my favorite songs. But anyway, that's what they were naming this since they were getting back together. Let's see here. Early 84, without the benefit of a new album or a video, sold-out concerts across the nation proved it was a success. Aerosmith began work on Done with Mirrors in July of this year, and the result are good rock and roll. The onstage energy of an Aerosmith concert is one thing, but sometimes that fever pitch is lost in the translation to vinyl. But master producer Ted Templeman was able to transfer that magic to the studio and to the record. Now, if you don't know who Ted Templeman is, he is the guy that produced basically all of Van Halen's stuff, all the way from their first album all the way through 1984. And so they brought him on board to try to, again, pick up the Aerosmith magic. As it said there, they got back together, went out and played, and of course they were doing well because it was all the original guys, but they needed a new album. They recorded this. It didn't do great. It wasn't until the next one that they took back off, and that was because of the Run-D.M.C thing. Okay, that's another. So Ted Templeman was able to transfer that magic to the studio and to the record. You're sure to tap your feet and maybe even get out of your easy chair and stomp your feet to these new Aerosmith tunes. The Hop, My Fist Your Face, Let the Music Do the Talking, and She's on Fire. Now, the song Let the Music Do the Talking is kind of interesting because when they left Aerosmith, when Joe Perry left and when Brad Whitford left, they went and formed a couple different bands. Joe Perry went and formed something called the Joe Perry Project, and Brad Whitford went and formed something called Whitford St. Holmes. And Whitford St. Holmes was Derek St. Holmes, who had sang, is it Derek? Yeah. Derek St. Holmes, who had sang with Ted Nugent. And so if you know the song Stranglehold, that's actually Derek St. Holmes singing that song. So it's an old Ted Nugent. Actually, he sang a lot with Ted Nugent. But the Joe Perry Project went out and actually created a song that was called Let the Music Do the Talking. And so when Aerosmith got back together to make this album, they took that Joe Perry Project song and re-recorded it to put on this record. Now, although the chorus is the same, but if you go listen to the Joe Perry Project one and the Aerosmith one, they're pretty different because they got rid of the verses and Steven Tyler put his own twist, and it's very Steven Tyler when you listen to it. Anyway, if you have not heard Let the Music Do the Talking by Aerosmith on this Done with Mirrors album, you must listen to it. It is a rockin', spectacular, I absolutely love it. I think it's amazing. Okay, Done with Mirrors is Aerosmith's 10th album, but only the band's second studio recording since 1979. It's also the band's best album in a long, long time. And when it says 10th album, I believe it's the 7th studio album. No tricks, no frills, no esoteric bull, just plain straight ahead boogie in your face, rock and roll. Dynamite. Maybe it was Done with Mirrors after all. Okay, that's the first review. And then these next two are very short. But they're, again, if you've heard this album, if you're familiar with Aerosmith, if you liked this, and I don't think, again, that this sold a lot, so there may not be a lot of people out there that are even familiar with it. So here's the next review. Aerosmith's new album is called Done with Mirrors. This one's in, by the way, the Courier, December 25th, 1985. This is Christmas Day. Aerosmith's new album called Done with Mirrors, Geffen, is called Done with Mirrors, and talk about your ironic titles. Perhaps someone was trying to convey the idea that the Boston band recaptures its old magic here, but The magic in this first LP by the original lineup in 6 years is strictly of the Done with Mirrors type. Cheap stage magic, strictly for the money. Guitarist Joe Perry and Brad Whitford's separate solo journeys led nowhere, so they are back in the fold. And the group has Van Halen producer Ted Templeman at the controls, but neither factor helps much. The most noteworthy thing about the LP is a pretty good packaging gimmick. Everything is printed backwards so that it can be read only with a mirror. Once widely compared to the Stones, Aerosmith has gone the way of that group and become pathetic old rockers trying to bite into the old grooves without any real teeth. The best you can say for Done with Mirrors is that it's no worse an Aerosmith imitation than any Rat LP. And this is one of the reasons I love reading these things, because we have the benefit of hindsight now. When this was out, this is before Love in an Elevator. This is before, I mean, how many, she's my angel. Sorry, don't mean to, but you remember all those different hits that they started having? Permanent Vacation came out, they had a couple of hits off there. Pump came out, a couple of hits off there. And it seemed, they just got right back on the map, and they were huge. They were bigger than ever once they got into that era. And again, with the hindsight here, we go back here and we read these critics who are like, these guys are such has-beens. This is so old. We're so over this, not knowing that the next year they were going to be coupled with Run-D.M.C. And then after that, boom, off to the races and awesome again. Anyway, that's one of the reasons I love this stuff so much. Anyway, he hated it, obviously. Okay, so here's the last one. This one, the title is, let's see, Aerosmith Done with Mirrors. It's in a column called On the Record. It's the Sheboygan Press, December 12th, 1985. Aerosmith Done with Mirrors. Aerosmith was one of the top bands throughout the 70s, and Done with Mirrors shows that the group from Boston is back. Starting out with its rousing anthem and first single from the album, Let the Music Do the Talking, Aerosmith proves to the rock and roll world that it's back with a vengeance. After 15 years of music, you would think a band would tire and just go through the motions, playing rehashes of old material. Not so with Aerosmith. Done with Mirrors contains some fine blasting rock and roll reminiscent of the good old days, i.e. Toys in the Attic in 1975 and Rocks in 1976. Yeah, and those were two, Toys in the Attic and Rocks were two of the kind of like touchstone, quintessential Aerosmith albums. Just so awesome. For Aerosmith rockers who've grown up, get back to your roots with Done with Mirrors. And he gives it 3.5 stars. I don't know what his, if he does 4 stars or 5, but anyway, at least this guy seemed to like it. So anyway, I'd love to get your feedback on this. If you ever listened to this album and what your favorite track was, because I loved so many things on here. The song Sheila was one of my favorite songs on here. And Let the Music Do the Talking was probably my favorite one. But yeah, I actually, My Fist Your Face is cool. The Reason a Dog was, there's so many cool songs on this album. I love this might be, of all the Aerosmith albums, this is up there in the top 3 maybe of my favorite things they ever did. I actually liked this better. Actually, Permanent Vacation was pretty spectacular. I didn't care much for Pump. Once that one came out, to me, they started losing me, but a lot of times, I don't know if this happens with you, but this is what happens with me. As soon as the band starts putting out all the big stuff, it's weird because it's the stuff I get less interested in. The stuff that comes out before they begin, it seems to me always sometimes better. So anyway, whatever. Aerosmith Done with Mirrors. If you ever heard it and you liked it, I'd love to get your feedback on it. If you saw them during those other tours without Joe Perry, Brad Whitford, I'd love to hear about that too, because I know they toured with Jimmy Crespo. Jimmy Crespo, by the way, after this stint with Aerosmith where they did the Rock in a Hard Place and did that tour, he went off and actually started working with a guy that I really, really liked named Adam Baum. Adam Baum had been in a band called TKO, and then he went and did a solo thing, and I think he might have even been on Geffen himself. But he had this he had this really, he put out one album, and it's Adam, A-D-A-M, Bomb, B-O-M-B. And he was, I actually went and saw him in concert. He had Sandy Slavin from Riot, Jimmy Crespo on guitar, I can't remember the guy, Phil Fate on bass, as I recall. And I went and saw them in Denver, Colorado. I'll have to do another video about this sometime. Showed up, there were no more than 30 people that showed up in a 1,500 seat arena, or not arena, but a 1,500 seat theater. Like 30 people were there. And Adam Bomb and that band was absolutely amazing. And Jimmy Crespo, who had played with Aerosmith during that time when Joe Perry wasn't there, was actually playing with Adam Bomb. He's on that album. It's called Fatal Attraction. And if you're ever interested in some kind of obscure 80s hard rock, and it actually is reminiscent of kind of of an Aerosmith kind of sound, sort of, find Adam Bomb and listen to that album, Fatal Attraction. He does a cover of a David Bowie song on there, All the Young Dudes, and it's pretty cool. Anyway, I didn't mean to get off on that. Feedback on Aerosmith. I'd love to hear if you heard this, if you saw them in concert, what you thought about this album, and of course, follow the channel, like the video, leave your feedback, and with that, as always, have yourself a fantastic day.